I'm Lana Merritt, and the night I returned home in a wheelchair, my family didn't even look at my legs. They looked at my bank balance. Mom's first words weren't, "Sweetheart, you're alive." They were, "Did you bring the money?" I sat there still smelling of hospital antiseptic, still shaking from the blast that ended everything I knew, and watched the people who raised me measure my worth in dollars, not in breaths. That was the moment something inside me cracked so loudly, I swear I felt it echo in my ribs. I thought I'd survived the worst of it overseas. I had no idea the real betrayal was waiting for me at my own front door. The ride back into Utah felt longer than any flight I'd taken overseas. The truck heater blew warm air against my hands, but none of it could thaw the heaviness sitting between my ribs. I watched the Wasatch Range rise in the distance, dusted in white, looking exactly the way it had when I left. Everything else, though, felt altered in ways I couldn't name yet. The closer we drove to the outskirts of Salt Lake City, the quieter I became. I'd prepared myself for the physical part of coming home: the ramps, the uneven ground, the stares from strangers, but not for the unfamiliar stillness settling in my chest. It was the kind of quiet that warned you something was waiting around the bend. When the truck finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the old Merritt place, my pulse kicked up. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its wood darkened by years of storms and sun. A porch light flickered weakly, fighting to stay alive in the cold evening air. I told myself to breathe, to expect awkwardness, not warmth. The engine shut off, leaving only the sound of wind brushing against the hood. My friend helped unload my chair, and for a second I sat there, staring at the front door like it might open into a life I could still recognize. But when it swung open, the look on my parents' faces didn't match the reunion I'd imagined during long nights overseas. They didn't rush toward me or say my name with relief. They simply stood there, caught off guard, blinking as though I'd shown up unannounced. There was no welcome, no arms outstretched, just two people trying to make sense of someone who had come home changed in ways they hadn't bothered to ask about. And in that instant, standing in the glow of a porch light that barely held on, I realized the hardest battle wasn't the one I'd already survived. It was the one waiting for me behind that door. Dad opened the door wide enough for me to wheel through, but his eyes slid away the moment I met them. Like looking at me might trigger something he didn't want to face. Mom's voice drifted over her shoulder as she moved back to the counter, telling me to come inside before I caught cold. As if I were just another inconvenience blowing in with the wind, the house itself felt exhausted stacks as of unopened bills on the coffee table. Sagging 1970s furniture patched with tape, walls bruised by years of hard seasons. Even the hallway lights flickered when I passed, buzzing like they were tired too. I pushed toward my old room with slow, uneven turns of the wheels, bracing myself for dust, maybe a fading poster or two. But when the door swung open, it was like stepping into a stranger's life. My bedroom had been gutted. In its place stood a cramped command center of debt file boxes stacked shoulder high, spreadsheets and loan documents strewn across a folding table, foreclosure notices clipped to a lamp. The only remnant of who I'd once been was a corner of my fearless poster, torn and shoved behind a safe as if someone wanted it out of sight. When I asked what happened to my room, Mom didn't bother turning around. She said I'd been gone too long, that they needed space to handle things, as though my absence had forfeited every piece of me that once lived here. I sifted through a stack of papers, trying to make sense of the chaos. When a loose sheet slipped free, I picked it up, and my stomach tightened. The name printed at the top wasn't mine. It read Lena Merritt, close enough to pass if no one looked carefully, wrong enough to expose a hurried hand. That tiny error felt like a warning flare, a hint of something rushed and hidden. Later that night, I lay awake listening to the soft but relentless flip of papers in the living room. Each turn echoed down the hallway like a countdown, steady and ominous. I didn't know what it was ticking toward, but I could feel it tightening in the air, drawing closer. Morning arrived with the dull clatter of pans and the low hum of the old furnace, but nothing about the day felt warm. I expected at least one question about how I was holding up, some scrap of concern. Instead, Dad asked if I'd started receiving disability payments. No pause, no gentleness, just straight to the subject of money. Caleb wandered in mid-breakfast, half awake, asking how often the VA sent checks, like he was comparing cable bills instead of talking about the aftermath of the blast that changed everything. I stepped out to breathe the cold air, the kind that clears your head whether you want it to or not. Mr. Wright from the neighboring ranch walked up, hands in his jacket pockets, and lowered his voice. He said the bank had visited the house 3 times in a week. He asked if my parents were all right. The weight of his question hit harder than the cold. Later that evening, while wiping down the kitchen counter, I spotted an envelope shoved behind the cabinet, hidden. Not misplaced. My name was printed across the front, but the contact number belonged to Dad. Inside was a notice about a loan waiting for a co-borrower's updated signature. Mine. I'd never agreed to any loan. Never signed anything. As I rolled into the living room, Dad and Mom worked under the dim yellow light, shoulders hunched, avoiding my eyes. Their silence wasn't ignorance, it was intention. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, sharp and certain. This wasn't an accident, and whatever truth had been buried in this house, it was finally tightening its way to the surface. Dinner should have been a moment to ease back into the rhythm of being under the same roof again. But the silence that settled over the table told me otherwise. My parents sat across from me with their hands clasped beneath the edge of the table, like 2 people holding on to a shared secret. Mom cleared her throat and asked which account my VA funds were being deposited into. She could note it for the bank. The question hit me square in the chest. I hadn't mentioned any payments. I hadn't even decided how to talk about what had happened to me. Yet somehow the first thing on their minds was what might be coming into my bank account. Before I could respond, Caleb tossed out a comment without looking up from his phone, telling me the bank would need a signature update, and I should just confirm I'd sign if they called. I turned toward him, startled, and asked what signature he meant. The moment the question left my mouth, he blinked like he'd stepped into a trap he didn't see coming. He muttered something about a previous refinance before Dad slammed his fork down and ordered him to stop talking. The air went heavy. Something was wrong. Wrong in a way that went deeper than disorganization or overdue bills. When dinner wrapped up, I wheeled away with an excuse about feeling tired. What they didn't know was that I'd slipped a thin packet of papers from the dining table into my jacket. In the quiet of the living room, under a lamp with a yellowing shade, I opened it. Refinancing package. Co-signer Lana Merritt. Page after page of numbers, signatures, and terms spilled out, and there it was, my name, signed in black ink that leaned left. The way a left-handed person writes. Dad was left-handed. I stared at it until the lines blurred. Someone had signed for me, someone who lived in this house. My hands shook as I closed the packet. This wasn't just a moment of desperation. This was coordination, planning, a pattern that likely stretched back further than I wanted to imagine. And if they'd done it once, they could do it again the next morning. Once my parents drove out toward the old barn, I called the bank. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked for every loan associated with my name. The woman on the line, Harper, hesitated long enough for dread to settle in my stomach. She listed them a refinance in 2019, another in 2021, a secondary loan in 2022. Each year hit like a punch. Each loan tied to me without my knowledge. When I asked who had signed them, Harper lowered her voice and said every signature belonged to me, at least on paper. I swallowed hard. I had never seen those documents, never touched them. I forced myself to ask whether something new was pending. Harper confirmed that the latest refinance was waiting only for a signature verification appointment. My breath stalled. They didn't just forge one signature, they were preparing the next step. Then came the twist that hollowed me out. Harper said my parents had told the bank I'd already agreed verbally. When I returned to the living room, they were hunched over documents again. Dad slid a stack under a newspaper like a child hiding a bad report card. He asked if I needed something. Voice strained. I asked what the new loan was about. He told me we'd discuss it later, that it was a family issue. His tone wasn't protective, it was territorial. As I wheeled toward the front door, a loose sheet in the trash caught my eye. I picked it up. Projected disability income. Below it, potential collateral. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the winter air. I wasn't just being used. I was being calculated. Night settled over the house like a weight, but sleep wouldn't come. The storm outside slapped against the windows hard enough to make the glass tremble. Yet the sound I couldn't ignore came from down the hall, my parents' voices, low and urgent, nothing like the weary whispers of two people getting ready for bed. I turned off my lamp so the house would think I'd gone to sleep, then eased my chair toward their room. Stopping beside the cracked door, Dad's voice cut through first, sharp and cold as the wind outside. If she asks again, we'll say she already agreed. She just needs to make it official. My grip tightened instantly. Mom's response was a strained whisper. I'm worried. She's changed. She might question this. Dad dismissed it. She's scared. She's weaker. She's our daughter. She'll fall in line. The words pierced deeper than anything that had happened overseas. I wasn't a person to them in that moment. I was leverage. A floorboard creaked as Caleb entered the room. If she refuses, we send her somewhere to get her head straight. A place where we can handle her finances. A facility. My chest tightened not from injury, but from fear. Mom muttered something about losing the ranch. Dad answered with a sentence that knocked the air out of me. We raised her for 18 years. It's time she pays us back. I backed away, pulse hammering, and turned toward the living room. A stray page lay near Dad's jacket. I picked it up. It was a loan estimate. Approval almost guaranteed thanks to veteran co-borrower high reliability. They didn't just need my signature, they needed my identity. At the far end of the hall, Caleb stood in shadow, whispering that if I messed this up, he'd go down with them. A chill ran through me that the blizzard couldn't match. Morning came thick with snow. My parents called me to the kitchen like a summons, the table covered in neatly ordered documents. Dad pushed a pen toward me and said it was time to sign so we could all move on. I told them I wouldn't. Dad's jaw locked before he admitted they'd already signed for me. Mom insisted I owed them. Caleb snapped that it was just one signature, and I had nothing else in life to worry about. I placed the bank's fraud letter on the table. The signature isn't mine. Silence. Panic. Anger. I pulled out the last file, my credit card, maxed nearly to its limit. Caleb listed as authorized user. His stammered excuse didn't matter. 3 faces stared at me with fear for themselves, not for me. And in that moment, I knew if I didn't leave soon, they'd take the rest of my life with them. I'd stayed silent far longer than I should have. Every sentence they'd thrown at me over the past days clung to my skin like barbed wire, claims that I owed them, that all they needed was one signature, that the whole family would collapse if I didn't fall in line. By the time night came, that wire had tightened enough to cut. I didn't return to my room after the meeting. Instead, I packed quietly in the living room, choosing only what still felt like mine, the letter from the teammate I lost, the photo of me before everything changed, the worn insignia I'd carried through deployments. They were small, but they were proof of who I was outside these walls. Snow hammered the porch when I rolled outside, thick and fast, coating everything in white. I pulled myself into the truck, each movement painful but necessary. The moment I reached for the door, it swung open behind me. Dad stumbled into the storm, boots sinking deep, and slammed his palm against the truck. Come back inside. You don't understand how much we need you. I kept my eyes forward. If I stay, I won't be myself anymore. Dragging my chair into the bed of the truck felt like lifting a mountain, but when the door shut, something inside me finally opened. Dad's voice broke into the blizzard, shouting that I'd regret this, but regret was the reason I left. I turned the key, headlights fighting the whiteout, and drove toward Salt Lake City, away from the battlefield that shared my last name, and toward the only freedom I had left. By the time I reached the VA center, it was close to midnight, and the storm had soaked through every layer of clothing I had on. My hands were stiff on the wheels, my legs numb with cold, and the moment the automatic doors slid open, the warmth inside felt unreal. A night shift nurse hurried toward me, eyes widening at the purplish tint on my skin. She didn't ask questions. She just guided me straight to an exam room. speaking softly as if she knew the difference between physical cold and the kind that settles inside a person. I barely slept. When morning came, the counselor stepped in with a clipboard and a look that made it clear he'd seen all kinds of pain, but maybe not this kind. I tried to speak calmly, but the words shook coming out of me, the forged documents, the signatures that weren't mine, the plan to put me in a facility so they could manage my money, the way my own family had turned me into collateral. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he let out a slow breath, set the clipboard down, and said it plainly. Lana, this is one of the most severe cases of family exploitation I've seen. Hearing it spoken by someone who had no stake in my past felt like a crack opening, terrifying, and relieving at the same time. The VA moved fast, faster than I expected anyone to act for my sake. They froze my credit so no one could open another account. They reported every fraudulent signature to the bank. They initiated requests to void all loans tied to my name. They created a protective file specifically for veterans targeted by family. They set an appointment with a VA attorney, and before noon, they arranged temporary housing so I wouldn't have to go back to the ranch. When the attorney reviewed my case, she shook her head slowly, lips pressed tight. You weren't just exploited. Your identity was violated. My phone buzzed constantly calls, texts, all from the same 3 people who had cornered me in that kitchen and asked for one more signature. I powered the phone off, for the first time in years. Silence didn't feel dangerous. Later that evening, I sat in the waiting hall under dim lights, exhaustion pulling at every part of me. A Marine veteran in his 50s lowered himself into the seat beside mine. He didn't look at me right away. He just rested a hand on my shoulder and said in a low voice, "Blood doesn't make family. Loyalty does." I swallowed hard, because in that quiet hall, surrounded by strangers who treated me with more dignity in a single night than my own family had in months, I realized something vital. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been abandoned by everyone. I'd found a place that stood with me finally, firmly, without condition. 3 weeks after I left the ranch, they showed up at the small apartment the VA had arranged for me. Dad stood in the doorway first, shoulders slumped, his face carved with lines that hadn't been there before. The anger he'd hurled at me that night in the snow was gone. What remained was exhaustion. Mom stepped in behind him, eyes red and swollen, clutching her hands together like she was holding herself up. Caleb came last, staring around the tiny space as though he'd crossed into a world he'd never known existed. Mom broke first. Her voice cracked the moment she spoke. "Lana, the bank is taking the house. Can you help?" I rolled into the center of the room and spread the files across the table, the fraud confirmation, the bank reports, the refinance documents that bore my name without my consent. Every page felt like placing a brick down between us, building a wall they couldn't step around. "This is what you did. And this is why I left." Dad sank into the nearest chair, pressing his palms to his eyes. His voice was small, almost unfamiliar when he said they were desperate, that they thought I would understand. "Understand," I asked quietly. "Understand that my injury wasn't a tragedy to you, just an opportunity. That the moment I came home, you asked about money instead of asking if I was alive." Caleb looked at me then, and for the first time since I returned, there was no blame in his face, only fear and shame. "We were scared. I was scared. I'm sorry." In that cramped apartment, I saw them not as villains, but as people swallowed by fear, drowning in bills, clinging to the only lifeline they recognized. But the truth was simple. They had grabbed onto me so tightly that I nearly drowned with them. My voice softened. But I held firm. "I forgive you, but I won't sign anything. I won't guarantee loans. I won't save the ranch with my identity." Silence filled the room, heavy but honest. Finally, Dad lifted his head. His eyes were tired, but clearer than I'd seen in years. "You have the right to choose your own life." A week later, we met again at a small diner off I-15. No shouting, no tears, just a simple meal and a few tentative stories shared over lukewarm coffee. When we stood to leave, Mom took my hand and whispered that I was still her daughter. I told her she was still my mother, just not someone I could sacrifice myself for anymore. On the drive back, I pulled over at the Veterans Memorial. I wheeled up to the stone wall, laid my palm against the cold surface, and whispered, "I survived. Not just the war, but the wounds that wore my family's face." The wind swept across the Utah plain, and for the first time, it didn't feel cold. I wasn't going back. I was moving forward into a life that finally belonged to me, 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 finally belonged to me.